Hi, my name's Nina O'Hare. I work for Worcestershire Archive and Archaeology Service, and I've also been the project officer behind Bewdley's Big Dig. So that took place in summer 2022. The project's coming to the end now, so I'm going to run through the results from all the test pits that were excavated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the project behind this and the bigger ideas behind Bewdley's Dig. I'm then going to look at all the test pits individually before looking at the story that we can learn from them when we put all of that information together. So first up, Bewdley's Big Dig is part of a wider project called Small Pits, Big Ideas. This has been a community archaeology project investigating rural medieval settlements in Worcestershire. So it's been as much about getting people involved in archaeology as it has been about doing real research into the medieval past of the county. Small Pits, Big Ideas visited 6 places around Worcestershire. You can see them all on the map there, Bewdley being the last one to have its big dig. They started in autumn 2021 and ran until last summer. The project's now coming towards the end, and this talk is part of a series sharing the results from each of the big digs. So the idea behind this project is to investigate and understand better the story of our villages. So we've been specifically looking at villages that are known to have medieval origins, or possibly slightly earlier, but they're villages that we still live in today. So in the past, archaeologists have been very good at looking at deserted villages. They're really easy to dig up. There's no one living there now. They're often big open fields and you can dig a nice big trench. That's great, but as someone sensibly pointed out a while ago, the story of those villages may not be the same as the story of the villages that people carried on living in and that we still live in today. So that's kind of where the test pitting projects have all come about from. In England as a whole, it's thought as a very sort of broad brush idea that villages start to appear in the early medieval period, so some point between the sort of the 10th and the 12th centuries. A lot of villages are thought to have become deserted around the time of the Black Death, which was in the 1340s. And that's what we know and the story we have from all our deserted villages. But is that actually the same story that's going on in the villages people carried on living in? And is that the case in Worcestershire? That might be the story we get in other parts of the country, but what about here? Because these villages are still lived in, we can't open up a really big trench and look straight into people's houses. But what we can dig are test pits. So test pits are just 1 metre square. You can fit them into back gardens and any other kind of open green spaces. The idea behind them is that you don't need to find a medieval house to know that people were living near that spot in medieval times. And that's because if you can find their rubbish and everything they threw out, you know that people were living nearby. Because until fairly recently, no one came and collected your rubbish. So people tended to throw out everything that was broken in the household, bits of food waste, anything like that. Got thrown as far away as people could kind of be bothered to go and throw it. Often that was kind of their back garden, backyard. Sometimes it ended up on manure heaps and then got spread over fields. But it's still unlikely to travel kind of much more than a mile from where people were living. So the more pottery we have of a particular date, the closer we're likely to be to where those people were living. And this project looks at pottery in particular because pottery is quite easy to date as it tends to change fairly frequently with fashions. So unlike things like bricks and roof tiles, things that are quite functional, those designs stay the same for centuries and centuries. Pottery doesn't, it changed a lot more frequently. So one test pit will give you the idea of sort of one sort of house plot, one small area. If you put them all together, you start to get the story of that village and that settlement. And if you do that across the whole region, you get an even bigger picture about what was going on across kind of a whole county scale. So this has happened a lot in East Anglia. Professor Carenza Lewis has pioneered a lot of test pitting over that way, and you can see on the map there all the black dots are places that have held test pitting. There's a really interesting story that's starting to emerge about the impact of the Black Death on the settlements of East Anglia, which is fascinating to hear about. But what we'd like to know is there a similar story going on in Worcestershire and the West Midlands, or have we got something different going on here perhaps? So that's a little bit of some of the ideas and the research that is behind all of the big digs. So I'm going to move on now to Bewdley in particular. I'm not going to give an extensive history of the town and the settlement here, but I do just want to highlight a few key bits of information about its early history. So the first thing to mention is that Bewdley, which now is a small town, that hasn't always been the case. So it started out its life as several villages. On the east side of the River Severn, there was Ribbesford, and a little bit further south and on the west bank of the river was Ribbesford. So both of these villages are mentioned in documents from the 11th century onwards. And the name Ribbon actually referred originally to both sides of the river. So parts of the settlement that we now think of as Bewdley, on the west bank where most of the town is today, that was originally referred to as Ribbon Hall, as was the other side of the river as well. And that seems to have continued until about 1275, when the West Bank started to be known as Bewdley, and the settlement there started to grow and develop into the town that we know today. We know that there was a bridge built over the river in 1480, around 1448, and a couple of decades later, in 1461, Edward IV became king, and the manor he owned, which included Bewdley, became a royal manor, and Tickenhall became a palace at that time. It's also thought that the settlement along Wire Hill, that area of Bewdley, developed around the 1460s, possibly as rebuilding after damage that the town sustained during the Wars of the Roses. So there's a fair bit known about the history of the town, but what we really want to get to with these test bits are the earliest days. So what was going on before Bewdley was a town. So on to the excavation itself. So in July 2022, 21 test pits were excavated across Bewdley. A total of 101 people took part in that, including Bewdley Secondary School. The aim of all these test pits was to get down to the natural geology, which is a term that archaeologists use for the bottom of the archaeological sequence. So archaeology doesn't go on forever. There's a point at which the layers in the ground stop containing objects that people have made, and it starts to be undisturbed geology. That's always a crucial point to get to, because if you can reach that undisturbed geology, you know that you're not missing any earlier archaeology. So if you stop finding, the earliest finds you've got are from the 13th century, say, you know that you're not missing earlier things. It's not that you haven't found them, they're just not there to be found. So that's just an important point to bear in mind as we go through the test pits. So here you can see a map where each red dot is one of the test pit locations. As you can see, they're pretty spread out. I'm going to run through these individually now, going sort of broadly, starting sort of in the centre and moving out a bit. So the first test pit 1, was at 6 Kidderminster Road, which is also known as Dogwheel House. So the house itself is timber framed, and it's thought to date from the early 17th century. The test pit was in the backyard and was incredibly deep. I think this was probably our deepest test pit at about 1.4 metres, and going still a little bit. So the ground seems to have been really well mixed up. There were Victorian finds, the 19th century things, right down to a metre. There was a little part of the test pit, so a sort of small quadrant that was excavated down to 1.4 metres. Fortunately, we didn't get down to the natural geology in this test pit, but it does just show how deeply built up some of the layers can be particularly within the centre of towns, where people have been living for a really, really long time. As the layers went down further in the test pit, and there was an increasing quantity of 17th and 18th century finds, the earliest material we had, though, was actually some roof tile rather than pottery. So there's some bits of roof tile that appear to date from between the late 15th and the 17th century. So sort of quite Tudor in date, or a little bit later. There was also a collection of quite early pottery, so 16th, 17th century. One of the pieces you can see in the bottom corner there, which is imaginatively named orangeware, which does tend to be fairly orange. That stripy piece is one of those. One of those bits of pottery as well, it's thought to come, or it looks a lot like pottery that you see coming from North Wiltshire, made around Ashton Keynes. This is something that you do find in Worcestershire. It does travel this far, but we don't see it very often. So that's something that's quite unusual to see, and probably an indication of the river trade that Bewdley was getting. So there's clearly kind of a good range of finds from this test pit, and definitely quite a bit from the 16th, 17th century onwards. So kind of broadly around the date that the current house is thought to kind of date from, but not very much earlier. So that might be that we just didn't get to those layers, or it might be that actually on this spot there isn't anything earlier to be found. So moving on to test pit 2, which is just over the road, moving now to the old police station, which has recently been converted into houses. So the ground here again seemed to be quite disturbed, probably during renovation and conversion works. Despite that, though, there are a few really quite interesting, very early finds from this test pit. So the earliest one is that slightly grotty looking piece of pottery down in the bottom right hand corner. So sometimes the most exciting things don't visually look the most interesting, but I assure you it is a piece of a medieval jug that had a green glaze with kind of a white zigzag pattern down it. So you can see a reconstruction up in the top corner. That's thought to date probably between the 13th and the 14th century is most likely when that comes from. And there's also a little bit of sort of slightly later medieval pottery, which is a shed you can see on the left there. So there are two quite early finds. There's definitely some hints of medieval activity going on here, as well as quite a lot of later pottery, bits of clay pipe, sort of general household rubbish that was being thrown out. So definitely some medieval activity starting to appear on what we'd think of now as the Ribbenhall side of the river. So test pits 3 and 4. Test pit 3 was at Lowther's Yard and test pit 4 was at Forecastle Lane. So just moving a little further away from the river now. So both test pits 3 and 4, unfortunately, half the test pits hit concrete, not very far below the surface, which is a hazard of being in gardens that people have, the areas people have lived in for a long time. So both of these test pits could only be excavated as sort of half the normal width. Despite that, test pit 3 did get down to 80 centimetres, which is pretty impressive depth. And the finds from here contained a lot of later 18th century finds onwards, but there's a couple of particularly nice pieces, including a bone button, which is on the bottom of the slide there, and at the top, that's part of a clay pipe. So it's missing the stem, but it would look sort of traditional pipe shape with a bowl you can put tobacco in and a stem, this bit you hold to smoke. It's a very dark colour, and we think that it's been soaked in stout, which apparently was a thing at the time. So people wanted their tobacco to also taste of beer. That presumably was the thing to do. So some quite slightly more personal things and particular tastes we can see from this test pit. Test pit 4 was fairly similar in some ways. The finds date there from the late 17th century onwards, so kind of a similar date range. There was a particularly nice collection though of Georgian tablewares, so the sort of pottery that you'd have out on the table to serve with, to eat off. Um, it's all those kind of slightly more refined things than you might see in the kitchen. There was a particularly large collection from that test pit, so it might be that there was someone who's particularly house proud or particularly keen to show off to their neighbours living somewhere nearby at that date. The finds from test pit 4 were all pretty small, which suggests that the ground has been really well dug over time, and that those finds have been rolled around quite a lot in the ground since they were thrown away. So moving on to test pit 5, still fairly nearby, we're moving on to number 21, Stourport Road. So the house there does date from the early 1800s, but the test pit was placed near the front of the garden actually to look at an older turnpike toll house. This was a little cottage that would have stood at the start of the turnpike, and you'd have had to have paid the toll um, to the person living in the toll house in order to use that road. We know that the toll house itself was demolished around 1840, so it's not been there for quite a long time, but we had a fairly good idea of where it once had stood. And we seem to have got the location pretty spot on. There was a lot of building material in this test pit, so clearly pretty close to where the building once stood. Interestingly, some of the building material was late medieval in date, so particularly bits of the roof tile. So there's indications that actually there might be some earlier buildings kind of nearby, or it might just be that the turnpike toll cottage was reusing some bits of kind of older roof tiles from buildings that kind of were no longer in use nearby. But certainly something within the area, some late medieval buildings going on. One of the quite nice finds from this test pit, which you can see photographed, is part of the handle of a 17th century bowl of some sort. So this is probably was part of a chamber pot or something called a porringer, which is like a little small handled bowl. Um, I always think handles are quite a nice thing to find because they seem a little bit more of a connection to people. You know, people picked up that handle. How many times have been picked up and used, and did someone accidentally drop it, you know, the last time and broke it, which is why it got thrown out. But you can, yeah, so that's a particularly nice one from this test pit. So we're moving across the river now to 3 test pits that were in Jubilee Gardens. So Jubilee Gardens is behind Bewdley Museum. The area has been open, we think, since medieval times. It's been used variously as gardens and brickyard and tanneries at various points, but it became the garden it is today in 1978 when it was opened as the Jubilee Gardens. We had 3 test pits across this area. In general, the finds we had from these 3 test pits all date from the 17th century onwards. So that was kind of the bulk of the finds that we have from these test pits, and quite a large quantity of it, particularly test pit 6. There was a very large quantity of 17th and 18th century finds, so kind of Georgian things that are being thrown out from all the townhouses nearby, probably into what was kind of a conveniently nearby space to dump lots of rubbish. What we did have though is a couple of earlier bits. So from test pit 6, which was in the centre of the gardens, there's a piece of Roman Severn Valley ware, which is the most common type of Roman pottery you find in Worcestershire. So there's definitely some indications that the Romans are passing through Bewdley. One bit of pot, unfortunately, isn't quite enough to make a Roman settlement. You tend to get quite a lot of Roman pottery if you're kind of right on top of a settlement, but there's certainly something going on. There was also a few sort of late medieval finds from test pit 7, which was a bit further south. So this test pit was against the gardens of houses that are along Lax Lane. So Lax Lane, for those less familiar with Bewdley, is a road that leads down towards the river. It's thought that the end of Lax Lane was originally a ford that might well have been used for a very, very long time. So it's certainly a good candidate for kind of very early settlement within Bewdley. So it's interesting that actually some of the earliest finds, certainly from this area, have come up nearby. So there was a couple of bits of pottery that have quite a broad date range from them, so 1200 to 1600, and then there are a couple of bits with a slightly tighter date range from 1500 to 1650. So definitely, certainly during that sort of Tudor era, um, possibly a little bit before that. There's definitely things going on in this area. There are a couple of finds from slightly later on, but they're kind of really nice, interesting ones. A couple that came up as well from Test Pit 16, which was the other one we had in Jubilee Gardens. One is a painted clay marble. There are a couple of other unpainted clay marbles as well from that test pit. These are probably Victorian in date, but it's really nice to find children's toys because we so often don't see children in the archaeological record. There obviously were loads of children in the past, and actually there were proportionally more children probably during a lot of times in the past than there are around today. But we often don't see them because for most of history, children either kind of made toys, played games that don't leave any trace, but we're making things out of organic materials that just don't survive, things that are going to rot away. And so it's not really until the Victorian era that we start to see toys that are made out of things that will last a bit longer, that are going to survive in the archaeological record. So that's a really nice one to find. There's also a clay pipe bowl, which is quite early in date. Um, that's the picture on the top there. So clay pipes are quite fragile, the bowl of them, because they're hollow, they usually get crushed in the ground. So what you more commonly find are the stems, so sort of little white sticks with a hole in the middle. And it's unusual to get actually the whole pipe bowl surviving intact. But it's really handy if you do, because that's the bit that kind of makes them easier to date. So that particular clay pipe was made some point between 1640 and 1680. So that is really kind of quite early on in sort of the fashion for smoking tobacco. So yeah, again, another quite nice find. And the last thing I just want to mention is that we also had from Test Pit 16 a disc of metal with a design on it that looks a lot like a cloth seal. So it's not definitely this, but it might be a cloth seal. And these are objects that get attached to rolls of cloth once they've been made. They're a sign of the quality of that cloth, but also that tax has been paid on it. They appear from the medieval period onwards. This one, if it is a cloth seal, is more likely to date from the 16th to the 18th century, so a little bit later, but still not a very common thing to find. So moving just away from the centre a little bit now, to test pits 8 and 11, which are at Cateshill and number 5, the park. So Cateshill is itself a pretty old house that was built in the 1740s. The test pit, though, was placed a little bit further away from the house, alongside Red Hill Road, and this was another of our really deep test pits. So this test pit went down to around 1.1 metres, which, given how hot the dig weekend was, is very impressive. The majority of this test pit, so the first 80 centimetres below ground level, were really well mixed and contained everything from 18th century finds up to really quite modern ones. Below that layer, though, we seem to have hit a Victorian or an Edwardian rubbish dump. This is exactly the sort of stuff we were wanting to get to. So um, rubbish that's been thrown away and no one's been back and kind of touched or moved since then. So archaeology kind of so often is about all the rubbish that people have thrown away in the past because it can tell us an enormous amount. And so was really nice to find. One of the particularly nice things that came out of that is a little bowl that was that has printed on it Ribbon National School 1906. So it's not complete, but fortunately we have all the writing, which is so rare. You usually get half the writing and the blank bit at the back. But that's particularly nice to see. Um, the There's no particular significance known to the date 1906, but apparently Ribbon National School did have a sort of celebration in that year, and it's possible that the bowl is something that was sent out to all national schools that they could then add their own name and date from whenever they had some sort of commemorative event to give out. So, so yeah, a particularly nice local find, that one. From test bit 11, which was at 5 The Park. So this is kind of along the high street. This house was originally built as a school around 1600. This test pit, a little bit like the one at Cateshill, contained a very thick layer with a lot of 18th and 19th century finds in it. So there's clearly been a lot of people dumping stuff in those centuries kind of in their back gardens and kind of building up the soil layers there. Key find, particularly curious one from this test pit, is a bit of a clay pipe so this is the stem rather than the bowl of it, and it has some Welsh writing on it, which I won't offend anyone by attempting to pronounce, but it translates as Wales forever. So this is this comes probably from the 19th century, so from the Victorian era, and there was a bit of a fashion or a trend for nationalist pipes, so kind of declaring causes or your kind of allegiances and views with whatever you had on your pipe stem. Most of the ones we find, though, and that are known are Irish nationalist pipes, and there's actually not many parallels that have been found by our finds archaeologist to kind of other Welsh national pipes. So it might be that this was sort of a call to arms, or it might be more something that people were selling as perhaps a bit more of a tourist, a sort of tourist objects to take home. Um, I think probably whatever the cause behind it, given that there's not so many known, it perhaps wasn't a cause that went too far, that was perhaps either quite short-lived or not too popular. Um, but it does beg the question of, was there quite a proud Welsh national living at this house around that date, or was this someone who perhaps just visited Wales at some point and brought it back as a bit of a curiosity? Should add as well from test bit 11, given that this site used to be a school, there was also part of a slate pencil and a slate writing writing sort of board, so a piece of slate with lines on it for children kind of learning their letters. Um, they're not too unusual to find bits like that, but it's really nice to find pencil and the writing slate together and on a school site. That is a bit more unusual, but a really nice one. And just makes you think about all the children who've sat there learning their letters, perhaps sometimes in lots of enjoyment, other times in lots of frustration. So definitely lots of stories that those have seen. So we're moving now back more towards the centre of Bewdley to test bit 12, which was along Lode Street. Lode Street itself contains quite a few early buildings, so the earliest of those that are still standing date from the 15th century. This test pit, though, which was in number 26, um, was placed more to test whether people dropped things along a route that's thought to have existed from Lode Street up to Tickenhill. Um, there was quite a collection of interesting finds from this test pit. Just to start with one of the slightly more recent ones, the illustration on the bottom of the slide um, is of a piece of a dish from probably from the 19th century, um, but it copies Japanese styles that were imported into England sort of in the preceding century or so, and, and quickly became quite popular, and English pottery started to copy those designs. So that's one with kind of quite global connections to it, that piece of pottery. Heading a bit earlier, there were a couple of pieces of medieval pottery from this test bit. So a few more bits of evidence starting to appear of medieval Bewdley. One is part of a cooking pot that has kind of broad date range of from the 12th to the 15th century. And the other is photographed on the slide there, which I know doesn't look particularly glamorous, certainly not compared to the Oriental-inspired Victorian ware at the bottom. But that little bit at the top is the rim of a little flared bowl that dates from the 14th to the 16th century. So sort of the second half of the medieval period, possibly sort of Tudor times. So definitely things going on quite early in this area. Certainly some hints of things that predate some of the standing buildings along Lode Street. And the last thing I want to share from this test pit is this. So the photograph shows a little piece of glass that comes from a pedestal glass, either a beaker or a goblet. So these date generally from the 16th or the 17th century. They're quite rare to find. It would have been expensive. We tend to only see them in towns, although very interestingly, we have had a piece from Bewdley's Big Dig, which is just north of Redditch. So that was a bit of a mystery, showing up in a slightly more rural area. But very helpfully, we've got the base of this, which is what makes it recognisable. So the bottom of these vessels had a little loop in the glass, or sort of a little sort of air gap left in the bottom. And it's that bit that we happen to have. One of the reasons why these are so rare to find is probably also because they're made out of something called soda glass, which actually doesn't survive very well in the ground. It can go quite flaky and degrades quite quickly. So not only were they expensive and a bit more rare to own, and there probably weren't so many of them around, and they actually just don't survive very well. So this is a particularly interesting thing to find. Perhaps a bit less surprising here in Bewdley. It really is an indication of the town's prosperity during those centuries, that there were probably wealthy merchants or wealthier residents who were owning some of the finer things that the sort of 16th and 17th centuries had to offer you. So test pit 13 now was a little bit further north. This test pit was at Gibraltar House along the Dowells Road. This one unfortunately had to stop after about 20 centimetres. There was a layer of building rubble encountered, and there was a concern that there might be asbestos mixed in with some of that demolition rubble, which obviously is not something that you want to disturb. However, from the 20 centimetres that was excavated, there was a small collection of finds that are kind of typical of household rubbish. So bits of kind of miscellaneous metalwork, a lot of iron nails, bits of animal bone, and some pottery that could be dated from the 17th or 18th century. So certainly some earlier things going on here, but unfortunately we couldn't get down any deeper. It was suggested though someone had a bit of a look in this garden. There's a well there, and it does look like this garden might well have been quite significantly landscaped. Um, so actually, it's possible that some of these finds may well have been imported from somewhere else. So if people have been kind of bringing in soil in order to kind of level up an area, kind of raise up past the garden, that they didn't originate from this site, that they might be from elsewhere. Um, so, so we don't kind of have an answer to without getting to the bottom, but still kind of a few things from there. So we're moving out now onto Wire Hill to test bits 14 and 15. Test bit 14 was at the Black Boy, which is one of Bewdley's oldest pubs, dating from the 15th century. This test pit was one of the ones that managed to get down to the natural geology. So hooray, that's the point we want to get to. This was about 70 centimetres down. So in comparison to some of the test bits we saw in the centre of Bewdley that were sort of 1 metre plus and still going, it does show you that around sort of the High Street and Lode Street, actually how deeply built up some of those layers are. But back to test bit 14, the finds we had from this test bit date from the 15th or 16th century onwards, and that's the same story that we really saw at test bit 15. But test bit 15, which was at 45 Wire Hill, that contained kind of a similar range of things, but just more, so more stuff. Interestingly, we've got 2 finds from test bit at the Black Boy that are related to drinking. So I'd like to think that these were used by people who came and were customers of the inn. That might not be the case. You can't guarantee that, but it's certainly nice to think so. So the first of these is a little red ware mug with either 2 or 3 handles. So these are cups for sharing. So at that time, this dates from sort of the 16th or the early 17th century, and sort of in the medieval period and sort of up to this date, if you went to a pub or an inn, you would have to take your own drinking vessels and cutlery or anything like that that you wanted with you. If you weren't well off enough to own kind of your own one, then you might share as a family a kind of drinking cup to take out with you. So the idea behind them having multiple handles is that you have a handle and you drink from the bit by your handle in order to kind of try and preserve a semblance of hygiene while sharing. So yeah, possibly something used by quite a few people. The second one is from a jug that's made out of something called stoneware, so quite a hard wearing type of pottery, and that's of a style I suggest it was probably made in either Germany or Belgium, so something that's been imported into this country. It is interesting that comparatively we had fewer finds from test bit 14, and it might be that actually there's less rubbish that was thrown out from the Black Boy because it was a pub, and if people are bringing, particularly in the early centuries, are bringing a lot of their own crockery and things like that with them, their own mugs, that actually they perhaps just had a little bit less rubbish to throw out. Or it might be that perhaps they were just throwing it a little bit further away than some of the nearby households. Um, Certainly what these 2 test bits do show is that we don't seem to have anything earlier than the 16th century. So that does support the suggestion that Wire Hill was a development from sort of the 1460s or a little bit later. It certainly, from these 2 test bits, which is admittedly quite a small sample size, but it certainly doesn't look like there was lots of earlier medieval settlement going on in this area and that Wire Hill was sort of continuously occupied. It does look like it was a later expansion of Bewdley. So we're moving out now out of Bewdley itself down to Ribbesford. There were 2 test pits out at Ribbesford, which were in the field immediately west of the church. So Ribbesford Church dates from around 1140, and there was a settlement recorded at Ribbesford in the Domesday Book, which was made just after the Norman Conquest. They wanted to know everything they owned, and that was made in 1086. Um, so we know certainly that there was some settlement out at Ribbesford, and it's not there today. There's not very much settlement. There certainly isn't anything you'd kind of call a village today. So those two test pits encountered quite a bit of stone rubble, um, but what they did encounter alongside that was quite a lot of medieval pottery, um, and all of that is starting to suggest that actually there was a settlement here between the 12th and the 14th centuries. That actually it looks like the people were living pretty close by. Some of the pottery has quite fresh breaks on it, so it doesn't look like it's been rolled around in the ground very much. And we also found layers that don't contain any later material. So it looks like these are deposits where medieval stuff has been thrown away in them, and they've not really been disturbed since then. Alongside all of that, there's a collection of kind of other finds, the most curious of which is a peach stone, or what appears to be a burnt peach stone, from test pit 9. So this was found in one of those far enough down that it was in a layer that is seemingly an undisturbed medieval layer. Yet it does look for all the world like a burnt peach stone. And actually, peaches are known for being grown in England from the early 13th century, but were presumably still pretty rare to see and probably quite expensive too. So it's perhaps looking like there's something slightly fancier going on here, so people who have access to more than your average person. Um, there were also, we've got bits of fish vertebra, so people are certainly eating fish, um, fish around this area, which you don't often pick up just because they're so small. And there's some finds that probably come from the church itself, so bits of stone roof tile. You can see an illustration of one on the bottom there, and some ceramic floor tiles as well. So here's a photograph of them. Helpfully, the one in the middle is glazed, and that's got a sort of tighter date range for it, from 1200 to 1500. But during the medieval period, you don't tend to see ceramic floor tiles outside of churches and other ecclesiastical buildings, so places like monasteries. So it's quite rare to see them anywhere else, just because they were kind of so expensive. And so these either have come from Ribbesford Church, or it might be that there's something like a manor house, something a really quite important building nearby. Here's a selection of just some of the medieval pottery that came out of test pit 9. So this is just from one layer. The majority of the pottery is from bits of cooking pot. That's the kind of most common thing we see from the medieval period, just probably because they broke so often. If you're continually putting a pot over the fire and cooling it down and heating it up again, they will break after a little while. So we tend to get lots of bits of those. And the majority of the pottery here was made either around the Worcester area or the Malvern area. So again, kind of things that look like they can easily travel up the river and arrive at Bewdley. So moving back across the river now to test pits 21, which was out on the Kidderminster Road, and test pit 17, which was on the Stourport Road. So test pit 17 contained a range of kind of everyday household rubbish from sort of the 18th century onwards. So bits of glass, pottery, little bits of animal bone, things like that. But amongst all of that, there was a worked flint flake. So This is something that people have intentionally shaped in the past. It's kind of on style grounds. It was probably come from the Neolithic, so the sort of uh, time when people started farming in this country, and that started around sort of 4000 BC, or the early Bronze Age. So it's got a very large date range. Obviously, 4000 BC to 1500 BC is a big difference, but that certainly is a flint flake that is at least 3,500 years old. So considerably older than anything else we've seen so far. And slightly mind-boggling to think actually how old that is. Test bit 21 contained, unfortunately, nothing quite that old, um, but pottery from mostly from the late 18th century onwards. There's some quite nice hand-painted Georgian or early Victorian pottery, but there's a couple of bits of 17th century pottery, so a few hints of earlier activity, some clay pipes, and some bits of Staffordshire slipware. So that's the photograph in the bottom there. Um, Staffordshire slipware is very distinctive. It's yellow and brown stripy, and looks surprisingly modern compared to kind of what you might, the real age of it. So we're moving a little bit further south now to test pit 18. So this is now the site of Bewdley Leisure Centre. But before that, there was a house here called Netherton House. The ground has obviously been very heavily landscaped, with the leisure centre and sports grounds being created. But below the top 20 centimetres, the ground did start to seem less disturbed. And interestingly, we did have some pottery from the 17th or 18th century, which does kind of probably does fit with the date of Netherton House. Interestingly, there was also quite a large piece of something that looks like it's come from a blacksmith's forge or a similar sort of hearth. I haven't photographed that here. It's not the prettiest looking, um, but it's particularly interesting, not just because it's kind of evidence probably of metalworking, but because it probably predates Netherton House. Um, it might well have come from a different site. Metalworking waste does sometimes get sold off as kind of hardcore, but certainly there's metalworking going on, and things probably going on in the area of Netherton House before that was built. So moving a little bit further south again, test pit 19 was at Netherton Lane. So the tithe map that was made in 1852 shows that there were cottages that are no longer present, but there were then on Netherton Lane. This test pit reached natural geology, so a great point to reach. And that really paid off because actually there was an amazing selection of finds from this test pit. So everything from prehistoric worked flints, and there were 3 of those. Not so many of those were closely datable, like the one we had from test pit 17. They could come from any point from the Mesolithic about 10,000 years ago up to the early Bronze Age, about 1,500 years ago. But certainly more evidence of prehistoric activity. And there were 3 bits of medieval pottery. One from a bit of a cooking pot, and 2 that joined back together. Alongside those, there was a little bit of 16th and 17th century pottery, and then the rest of the finds date from the 17th century onwards. And you can see on the slide there an illustration of what these medieval cooking pots looked like. They're quite sort of straight-sided, slightly curved base. They weren't necessarily huge, but that was kind of the standard shape that they took. Interestingly, the finds from this test pit fit quite closely with some that were found during field walking around 2000. So in 2000, there was some field walking around Netherton Lane, and that's recorded as having found a little bit of flint. So again, some prehistoric activity, one piece of Roman pottery. Fortunately, we didn't tick off Roman during the test pit, um, but 16 sherds of medieval pottery, as well as some 16th and 17th century pottery as well. So quite a close match to the finds from this test pit. And actually, when you add in the 16 sherds of medieval pottery previously found to the three we found here, it's actually starting to look like quite a sizable amount. There's certainly some medieval activity going on near to Netherton Lane, if not in Netherton Lane itself, during the medieval period. And last but by no means least, we're on to test bit 20, which was at Lower Blackstone Farm. So this test bit, due to time, could only get down to 30 centimetres, but it was in quite a good location near the old front door of the farmhouse. The ground here was clearly quite churned up. Another prehistoric flint turned up here, which is that little grey piece in the photograph there. This is actually a specific tool that was used for scraping to things like cleaning hides, and it comes from the early Bronze Age. So sort of around 2500 to 1500 BC. So it's certainly been around for a very long time, that. Alongside what is really quite a tiny find, you can see millimetre scale underneath that Bronze Age scraper. It is called a thumbnail scraper because it is about thumbnail size. Alongside that, there was a selection of 18th to 20th century pottery, bits of glass, clay pipes, building material, and what was one of the largest find by quite a long way from any of the test pits, and that was part of a rainwater drain pipe. So probably some point late Victorian or early 20th century, but the group who excavated test pit 20 were very proud to have found the largest find by a considerable way from this big dig or any of our other big digs. Just want to point out that digging is only part of the archaeological process. So it's obviously the bit that people think about the most, digging everything up, but there's just as much that goes on after the digging's finished as there is kind of during the big dig weekends. So once everything's dug up, it has to be washed in order to be able to actually see what it is and date it and identify what it is. Once they're clean, things get sorted. The pottery also gets marked as well with where it's from. So thank you very much to everyone who took part in the finds team, and to Ken and David for their patient guidance as well, and considerable organisation it takes to keep all the finds sort of neatly organised. So thank you very much to everyone who took part in that element of the project. So now we've been through all of the test bits, just want to have a quick look at actually the bigger pictures that we've started to uncover when we put all of these finds together. So starting kind of at the beginning, there's hints of prehistoric activity and that one little bit of Roman pottery that have come up from the test pits. Interestingly, all of the prehistoric finds have been clustered along the east bank of the river. Add to this the fact that there's a known Iron Age enclosure that was excavated in the 1970s a little bit further south of Lower Blackstone Farm. So there is already a known Iron Age site in that area. There was also a little bit of Iron Age activity that was found whilst the science block at Bewdley School was being built. So there's certainly hints of perhaps a second prehistoric settlement going on, and bits of activity that predate the Iron Age as well. So certainly that little thumbnail scraper from test pit 20 predates that. That's from the Bronze Age, whereas these settlements are from the Iron Age. So I think probably kind of millennia of people using certainly the east bank of the river. And just to show you The test pits that found prehistoric flint are marked with a blue triangle, and that piece of Roman pottery is marked with that darker triangle over in Jubilee Gardens. And moving on then to the medieval period, there are some finds that date from the 12th to the 14th century. So this is kind of the centuries after the Norman conquest. The test pits that had finds from that date are in black. The larger the dot, the more finds they had of that date. So as you can see, the thing that stands out the most is there was definitely something going on at Ribbesford. So test pits 9 and 10 contain quite a lot of medieval pottery, and it certainly looks like there's a settlement there. There's quite a bit come out of test pit 19, so over at Netherton Lane, looks like something else going on there. And just kind of a single piece each from test pit 2 and test pit 12, so kind of on the Ribbenhall and the Bewdley sides of the river. So alongside those two areas, Ribbesford and Netherton Lane, which is also looking like that there probably was some medieval settlement going along there. Within what's now the town, there are some hints of medieval activity going on, but unfortunately we don't have enough of it to say quite what's going on. So a single piece of pottery could be just something that's ended up scattered with manure, so it's ended up on sort of a rubbish heap with all the animal dung that then gets spread over fields, and it could come from farmland. So it could be that kind of that area of Lode Street or the Ribbenhall. At that time, it might be farmland around medieval settlement, and that people's houses were a little bit further away, or it might be that actually people were living on those spots during the 12th to 14th century. Certainly by the 14th century, that probably is looking more likely. But without more of pottery of that date, more finds, it's hard to say for definite what was going on. Just want to look at a slightly different angle at some of the medieval finds, at where they were coming from, because I think this starts to show us something quite interesting about the settlement here. Sort of in the centuries before it became a kind of fully fledged town. 2/3, so a really significant percentage of the pottery from Bewdley's test pits that predates 1350, so everything sort of before the Black Death. 2/3 of that comes from Worcester and Malvern. So these were two really big pottery production areas, kind of locally during the medieval period. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of pottery that's come from those areas. And the rest of the pottery comes from kind of a bit further afield or kind of looking sort of north into Staffordshire. What's interesting though is that we also held a big dig in Worcestershire, which is just 6 kilometres away, kind of as the crow flies. There, only a quarter of the pottery came from Worcester and Malvern, compared to 2/3 in Bewdley. And the majority of Wolverley's pottery appears to have either been locally made or comes from places like Staffordshire and kind of looking north rather than looking south. That's really quite a striking difference and really shows how important river trade was for Bewdley, even before it was the town that it kind of later grew into. The river's also kind of the likely reason that there are a couple of finds from even further afield that have been found. So although it's a very small quantity, there was a bit of medieval pottery that comes from Bristol and another bit from the Buckinghamshire area. So they're not unheard of to find in Worcestershire. We certainly do find them, but they're not so often found up in the northwest corner of Worcestershire. And certainly we didn't see anything like that in Wolverley, which is not very far away. So it just shows that actually settlements can be fairly near to each other, but they can still have quite different stories and quite different things going on. Just quickly want to have a look at the impact of the Black Death. So during the 14th century, so the 1300s, there was a bubonic plague that swept through Europe, also known as the Black Death in the 1340s. There was also, before that, a series of other crises. So there was a European-wide famine in the first part of the century, and that was followed up by a very severe cattle disease that wiped out a lot of people's herds. So if you ever go back in time, I recommend not picking the beginning of the 14th century. Not a great time to be around generally. Only 3 test pits contain finds that date from sort of shortly after all those crises, so from sort of the mid 14th to the 15th centuries. It's really tempting to link that small quantity of finds to all those crises and say, actually, look, that's evidence that these settlements suffered and kind of shrunk after the Black Death. What we have to bear in mind, though, is actually that because wages went up, because there were just fewer people around, actually people started to be able to afford metal cooking pots, whereas previously they'd used ceramic cooking pots. And most of what we were seeing before the Black Death in terms of pottery comes from cooking pots. So if you take cooking pots out of the equation, actually you're not left with very many ceramic finds or any other sort of finds that are easily datable. So a lot of that drop is likely to be that actually people were just shifting from one style of cooking vessel to another. Having said all of that, the settlement out at Ribbesford has a lot of finds from the 12th to the 14th century and nothing really from the centuries afterwards. It's obviously not much of a settlement there today, and it has to have shrunk at some point in the past. So it might be that that the kind of some of the factors behind that shrinking are linked to some of those crises during the 14th century, and that perhaps in Ribbesford specifically there was perhaps much more of an impact that we can see going on there. One of the questions we'd want to look at was Wire Hill. Does that seem to come from the 1640s and be a sort of rebuild after the Wars of the Roses? We obviously can't say for definite whether people started building in that area because of damage due to the Wars of the Roses. But what we can say is from our small sample size, we haven't found anything earlier. So certainly that theory is not contradicted by the test pit finds. We've got stuff from the 16th century onwards. So if anything, it perhaps looks like that settlement was maybe a little bit later than the 1460s. Maybe it took them a couple of decades to actually get around to kind of recovering and doing that redevelopment. The vast majority of test pit finds from Bewdley come from the 16th to the 19th centuries. So this is partly because the town grew in size and prosperity, and therefore there were more people who were just creating more rubbish collectively. But it's also partly because actually people started to be able to own more stuff. So some of it is that as the town grew, some people probably did grow in wealth, could own more things, but actually the average person started to be able to afford to buy more bits of pottery, more household items. And that really ramped up from the sort of late 18th century onwards, when the Industrial Revolution started to kind of kick in, canals started to be built, and goods started to be produced and transported much more cheaply than they previously had. Now, I just want to point out that one of the key things I mentioned early on is whether the test pits get down to the natural geology. So have we found the earliest possible evidence in that test pit or not? Now, in the case of Bewdley's test pits, a lot of those turned out to be very deep. The map on the slide there it has colour-coded each test pit depending on whether it got down to the bottom of the archaeological sequence or not. So all the dots in black are ones that hit the natural geology. As you can see, there's just 4 of those. The ones in grey are ones that possibly got down to the natural, and there's another 4 or 5 of those. And then the ones in red are ones that definitely didn't get to the bottom. So those were all the ones in red. So there's quite a lot of those. Um, some of those are for various reasons of hitting kind of demolition rubble or having quite a short amount of time. But it is important to bear in mind that actually the very centre of Bewdley and Ribbenhall have been occupied for a really long time. And the layers there are just very deeply built up because people have been throwing a lot of rubbish away for a long time. To put Bewdley's test pits in perspective, the majority of the other big digs have encountered the natural geology at sort of between 40 and 70 centimetres. So there's been a build-up of sort of up to 70 centimetres in most of the test pits or less. In Bewdley, a lot of the test pits got to 1 metre and they were still going. So there's clearly a considerable build-up of archaeological material, and that's definitely something to bear in mind for the future, that some parts of the town centre actually you just need to open up a bigger area where you can get down a little bit deeper if you want to get to those really early medieval layers, assuming they are there to be found, that's to be said. Just last, to have a very quick comparison with some of the other big digs. The first thing to kind of say that jumped out at Rob Hedge, who did our finds analysis, is that there's not very much metalworking waste from Bewdley. So again, a lot of the other big digs had quite a lot of metalworking waste, partly because it was sold off as hardcore, and you can find it a lot in rural areas. Not necessarily because people were metalworking on that spot that there was a forge and a blacksmith, but just that people were using it. In Bewdley, there were 45 pieces of metalworking waste found from 21 test pits. From Wolverley, where there were 15 test pits, there was almost 300 bits of metalworking waste found, which is really quite a striking difference. It might be that metalworking was happening more commonly in rural areas, and that actually in Bewdley town there wasn't much metalworking going on. It was sort of relegated to sort of less populated areas. Or it might just be that actually they were kind of shipping all that waste out. People didn't really want to use it in the town for whatever reason, but in rural areas, people did want it as kind of useful hardcore. So not an answer there, but something interesting to ponder. The other particularly striking thing is that none of the big digs, so none of the 96 test pits that have been excavated across the 6 big digs, have produced pottery that predates the Norman conquest, so before 1066. And actually, all of these settlements are known from historic documents to have slightly earlier origins. We might not, in all cases, be looking in the right part of the parish, the right part of the village, but from 96 test pits, at least one should have produced some of that very early medieval, or sometimes called Anglo-Saxon pottery, if it was there to be found. The fact that we haven't found any of it, I think, tells us not that we're missing it, just that it isn't there to be found. Actually, that's a really striking and significant difference between other areas of the country. So over in East Anglia, there's the test pitting there has been able to see those very early centuries, the very earliest days of villages, because pottery is used over there kind of for everyday cooking, and you do get it. In Worcestershire, that doesn't seem to be the case. People are obviously cooking still, but they're not using ceramic cooking pots. What this, I think, is telling us is that there is a bit of a cultural shift that went on, and that before the Norman conquest, and probably for a century or so, maybe after, people are choosing not to use ceramic cooking pots. They're certainly made. People could get hold of them if they wanted to, but for whatever reason, they're choosing not to. And it's only after sort of about 1250 that people start using cooking pots much more frequently. Um, and there's a bit of a shift going on all of us, what it seems like all of a sudden to us, it probably wasn't. It's probably a very gradual shift over decades, and with people's views changing. Um, but there's something really interesting going on there, that will certainly be interesting to kind of look at more and explore in the future. That was a bit of a whirlwind trip around the 21 test pits and sort of thousands of years of history. If you'd like to find out more, there will be an excavation report coming out, so do look out on our social media or our website for that. Our website's explorethepast.co.uk. There's also currently at the moment a touring exhibition that's travelling around Worcestershire. That's currently at the Hive in Worcester and is there until 29th of March 2023. So do go and have a look at that if you're interested in the story of all 6 settlements being drawn together and looking at the collective stories that have been uncovered. And just to show you, here's a sneak peek of the exhibition itself. And the last thing I want to say is a huge thank you to everyone who took part and to make the dig possible. Whether you hosted a test pit, excavated it on an incredibly hot weekend, helped with the finds team, took photographs, or helped in another way, this wouldn't have happened without you. I'd like to say a special thank you to Heather Flack and to Bewdley Historical Research Group for all of the organisation, enthusiasm, and coordination that made the project happen, along with Bewdley Museum for their support and assistance over the weekend, and especially those who stepped in kind of at the last minute to help. Sarah Jennings took a lot of the photographs, so thank you very much to her, and Cam MacDonald for overseeing the finds processing. So as you can gather, there was a lot of people involved in making this happen. And I'm going to leave you now with a picture that was created by Rob Hedge, who also did the finds analysis, which shows the earliest settlement activity found in each test pit. So that's a little coloured dot around it, and then a selection of key finds and some of the highlights from the Big Dig. The project, the bigger project overall, so Small Pits, Big Ideas, has been a partnership between a lot of organisations. We've been running it on behalf of Worcestershire Archaeological Society, and we've had funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So everyone who buys National Lottery tickets, thank you very much for making projects like this happen. I'll leave you now with that image, but thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed finding out more about Bewdley's early days.